Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second session in the 2026 Plastic Advocates webinar series. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory, or MRBO for short. Also with us tonight is my MRBO co-founder and co-director, Ethan Duke. We are very happy to see everyone here. We have more than 100 people on tonight, and given our registration, I bet we'll get a few more as we go along. Here at MRBO, our mission is the conservation of birds and all wildlife and their habitats through science, education, and advocacy. And sometimes people ask us, why would a bird observatory get involved in hosting webinars on plastic and human health? Well, because plastic pollution is one of the most urgent threats to life on this planet. And it's therefore a priority that directly interconnects the well-being of every plant, animal, and human. We at MRBO have been working on the plastic issue for about 6 years now, and we're very grateful for our partner organization here in Missouri, Stream Teams United, with whom we are in the midst of a 3-year project. And I'm going to throw links to that project in the chat real quick here. There we go. The Show Me Less Plastic project is funded by Missouri Foundation for Health, and we work on the systemic reduction of plastic use and production in Missouri and beyond through a blend of public education, policy advocacy, and coalition building. So folks, in the spirit of all of our shared conservation and health missions, we hope that these webinars will inform you and inspire you to safeguard both human health and our fellow creatures of all shapes, sizes, and habitats. Without further ado, on to our webinar of the evening. We are very, very happy to welcome our friend Megan Wolff. Dr. Wolff is an organizer and subject matter expert on the subject of plastics and health. She is the founder of the Physicians and Scientists Network Addressing Plastic and Health, or PSNAP, which just officially had a birthday. At PSNAP, Megan forged connections with healthcare professionals and research scientists, creating a network of highly trained individuals who are concerned about the human health impacts of plastic. Megan holds a doctorate and a master's degree in public health from Columbia University. She believes that the well-being of the ecosystem and the health of those who live in it are inextricable. We cannot live on a planet we pollute. My friend, please tell us about plastic and human health.
Okay, well, you'll be sorry you asked, Dana, but I'm really happy to be here. So let me share my screen and let's get to it. As ever, I have too many slides, so I'm gonna move fast, but I'm gonna try to keep it interesting. And I know a number of you in the audience, so you've heard me say this before, but there's no time like the present to say the same thing over and over again because it's true, which is that history is not inevitable. This was my lesson from my background training, which was initially the history of medicine, learning that people make history. It doesn't just happen. And if you look back at how things came to be, you can usually find individual actors or a couple of actors and see where things zigged instead of zagged. And that's good news, because once you see the decisions that people made and why and how they made them, you can start thinking about unmaking them, because problems are not inevitable. We did them, so we can solve them. And this is nowhere more true, frankly, than the environmental fight, especially the plastics fight, which is really brand new to history. Plastic as we know it today has been around for about 80 to 90 years, really, not more than that, because most of the mass-produced plastic, as you saw Rebekah Creshkoff's presentation a couple weeks ago, it came to us since World War II. So this is a really recent problem. And there is no passive voice here. We can see the people who made this problem. Some of them are still sitting in the same offices that they were when they created the problem. Note to self, or note to selves, all of you, you can check your plastics guilt at the door here, because this is a systemic issue. Unless you personally were employed as a lobbyist by a company trying to push plastic in places it didn't need to be, you did not create this problem. It came to you and you're dealing with it like the rest of us. So we'll talk about what it means to be dealing with it, and we will talk about gosh, just lost my train of thought right there. We'll talk about what it means to deal with it, and we'll talk about how we're going to get out from under this and what it's doing to humans and why we need to get out from under this. So Just a little bit more background, like Dana said, I created the Physicians and Scientists Network because I saw an opportunity here to get some force multipliers. When you walk into a room and you start testifying about plastics, people pay attention because they're interested. But if you start talking about it as a medical professional or as a research scientist, people can become a lot more interested because of the way that we're starting to understand plastics impacting health. First, from microplastics and people wondering what are they doing in the human body, and then from the sense of, oh, okay, even our exposure to regular plastic is actually causing an issue. So we'll talk about all of that. And as Dana mentioned, PSNAP is 1 year old now. Yay! As of about yesterday. So we've got more than 150 people and we have momentum. We're moving fast. It's been a lot of fun. I want to also say this from the outset. Despite what I may sound like, I am not a plastic abolitionist. Particularly from the perspective of medicine, we know that there's such a thing as necessary plastic. If you walked into what might have passed as an emergency room, which actually at Mount Sinai it was called the emergency closet, in the mid 1800s, you would have seen materials like the ones on the left-hand side of the screen. Today, frankly, I'd rather be attended by the ones on the right. Most of these are pretty necessary, but I will say a lot of them are repetitive. They could be reduced and they can be reformulated. They don't need to be as disposable or as hazardous as they are. So we're dealing with a lot of low-hanging fruit here, and that's the first place that we can look at. But in general, this is what most people think of when they think of the plastics crisis. They think of plastic, plastic everywhere. And indeed, it is a volume problem. We've got nearly 10 billion tons that we've created since 1950, and this is on track to expand astronomically. Plastic production doubles about every 14 years, and it's on track to triple now by 2060. So where will we put all of that plastic? That's anybody's guess, but also what will we even use it for? Much of it right now is single-use plastic. About 42% of all plastic under manufacture is for packaging. A lot of that is single-use, and that's often where the great excesses come. That's where a lot of this growth gets tracked into. So think about those new plastic objects that are suddenly indispensable, but you didn't have about 10 years ago. That's a lot of the single-use stuff. Anyway, what the real problem is, though, from the perspective of medicine and science, has to do with the relationship between plastics and plasticizers, or plasticizing chemicals, the stuff that goes into making the plastic do and be all of the things that we want it to do and be. Make it flexible, make it hard, make it pink, make it shiny, make it waterproof, make it UV resistant, and so on. That's chemicals. About 70% of the synthetic chemical industry is actually tied to plastic. We make 10 times more plastic than pesticides annually, but the majority of our plastics and their chemicals are untested. The ingredients are unknown, and there's chronic and universal human exposure. This is not a question of what you're applying over here or applying over there. You cannot get away from plastic, especially as a human being. Much of our interior worlds have plastic all over them, from my computer to the resin on my desk. That's very different from, say, the exposure of an animal outdoors. I spend 90% of my time indoors, apparently, statistically, and so do most of us. That's a lot of exposure, too. Plastics received almost no attention at all from EPA, though. It's largely unregulated. Now, if we're pouring this amount of plastic into our environment, both the tangible, what you're sitting around and holding in your desk, and the untangible, the chemicals that simply are released in the process, that means that we have a lot of what we call novel entities all around us. And Rachel Carson was really the first person to put her finger on the problem of synthetic novel entities. In Silent Spring in the early 1960s, she pointed out, given time, not in years, but in millennia, life adjusts, and a balance has been reached. For time is an essential ingredient, but in the modern world, there is no time. So this is a problem not just of volume, but of speed. We're pumping our world full of a material to which we cannot adjust at the rate that it's coming in. And if we can't, neither can most other things. Humans are outstandingly adaptable because we change our immediate world to suit what we need, but not very many creatures are able to do that. So we see a lot of this, a lot of what looks like plastic pollution. And yes, it is plastic pollution. Sometimes in the environment, it almost looks adaptive at first glance, like this bird and this nest. But of course, those in this audience know that this is not adaptive. A lot of the time, this is fatal due to entanglements, to eating, to all kinds of problems that beset wildlife as they encounter plastic. But from a medical and scientific point of view, we're understanding more and more that the problem isn't just what we can see, it's what we can't. It's the part where the macroplastic garbage starts breaking down into microplastics. Because plastic doesn't break down in the environment, it breaks up instead into tinier and tinier pieces that don't stop breaking down. They will go all the way down to basically the molecular level, and they will still be plastic. So, for instance, these are microplastics that have reached a microscopic level on an insect found in Adirondack State Park in 2023. Now, there's not a lot of plastic production or disposal or even use in Adirondack State Park, but these microplastics have become so present in the environment that these traveled on wind, through rain, through snow to get to such a remote area. At least that's what the investigators think probably happened, but it keeps on getting smaller. So those microplastics that we saw might have been the size of the width of a pencil tip or a grain of salt. Down here, this is the medical side of this chart. It says inhalable. Okay, so you could inhale that, but you're probably going to cough it back out because your lungs are adapted to be irritated by tiny particles until they become too tiny. A particle of smoke, or the size of the COVID virus, or even the width of a strand of DNA. Like I said, microplastics just keep going down. So these nanoplastics are so tiny that they're what's called respirable. They slip right across the alveoli of the human lung and any lung and into tissue, into the circulatory system. And they do the same thing in the intestine. So those are our routes of exposure, and this is how it is that we're starting to find nanoplastic pretty much everywhere we look, even inside the human body. Now, this is what we can see on a snowflake, but we can also see it's getting caught up in plant vasculature, moving around all over the planet. That means we're also eating it. So if we're breathing it, we're drinking it because it's in the water, and we're eating it because it's in the food, even the plant-based food. What does that mean for us when it gets inside of us? Well, these are the main routes of ingestion, of I guess ingestion, inhalation, dermal contact. These are the way that it gets into us. Dermal contact, that has more to do with, we think, um, plastic clothing that contains, of course, lots and lots of additives. So polyester, the dyes, the additives, the plasticizers in the clothing interact with your skin as you sweat. And so that's how they slip across the dermal barrier. There is an active debate about whether micro and nanoplastics can cross human skin, and it's really a question of how effective is skin at being skin. How much does it block? Of course, it would block microplastics. If you're thinking about something, though, the size of a strand of DNA, that could potentially slip across skin, but it's still in the discussion phase. What we do know, though, is that we're eating a lot, drinking a lot, and breathing a lot. And there was an article that came out, oh gosh, maybe 4 years ago now, estimating that some of us, under some circumstances, may be eating as much as a credit card of plastic a day. Which immediately sent the media into a tailspin, saying, "Oh my gosh, we're all eating a plastic credit card a day." Sorry, a week. It was a week. Don't panic yet, right? Um, Obviously, this gets attention. Obviously, this is alarming. Now, for most of us, the quantity is probably much lower, but people respond, and they responded especially with humor, because how can you avoid eating, drinking, being exposed to something that's this common? So we start joking around. The internet shows all of how we feel about this. Microplastics on your food, microplastic as a salt, the 2030 food pyramid with antidepressants at the top and microplastics at the bottom. Memes like, I eat a credit card every Sunday, just get it all out of the way and have a nice plastic-free week. So we use humor to handle what we can't control, and it also reflects a lot of our preoccupations. Um, but this is where the real story is. Where are the microplastics? Well, this is a study that came out in 2021 demonstrating that microplastic was on both sides of the human placenta, the maternal side and the fetal side, meaning it could get through the placenta. Now, this is upsetting in and of itself because we don't like the idea of fetuses being exposed to chemicals and plastics, but it was particularly upsetting to medical science because it put to rest the idea that there were impermeable barriers through which plastic wouldn't pass. It had always been thought that the placenta was keeping the infant safe from whatever external stuff mom was getting exposed to. That's not the case. In a way, this kind of was the starting gun on a whole lot of research that's happened since then about where the microplastics are. And we can see it moving from feces in 2018 to the lungs, meconium, sputum, blood, breast milk, liver, veins, testes, and semen. That one got a lot of attention, both for the obvious reasons and for the less obvious to lay people, which is that there's a testicular barrier that acts, we think, like the fetal barrier, like the placental barrier, and keeps that area of tissue pure and safe. Except that it turns out it doesn't where microplastics are concerned. Heart tissue, kidney. Now there's one more barrier that's on everybody's mind: carotid plaque, brain. That's the one. That's the one that was the most concerning of all, in a way, because if it can slip across the blood-brain barrier, then it's messing with our sense of self. That's messing with our cognition, our capacity to be as human as we see ourselves being. And in May of 2024, lo and behold, we find it's across the brain. And it just keeps on going. There aren't a whole lot of places left to look, but maybe that's my lack of imagination. In any case, it's being found. And here's one of the examples of what we think it's doing as it comes into the body. It's very, very difficult to track the actual mechanisms of harm to see what this fleck of nanoplastic eventually may do, partially because you can't see the nanoplastic, and partially because the exposure is chronic. It takes a long time. It's not like something like arsenic where you are exposed and then boom, there's an instant response. So this is a study where doctors who were doing endarterectomy on patients, that is, that their carotid arteries had clogged up with plaque, and the carotid is the one in your neck. And so they were going through and they were taking the plaque out, and then they looked at the plaque for, it was around 300 patients. And they found that of those patients, 58% of them had plastic in the plaque of their arteries. Then they followed them forward over 36 months, 3 years, and they found that the ones who had the plaque in their carotid arteries had a 450% increase in heart attack, stroke, and death. That's this group, as opposed to those that did not have the plastics in their arteries. Now, this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is usually, it's basically the journal of best repute. It's beyond the threshold of unimpeachability. By the time you're published in the New England Journal, you have been very, 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 very carefully vetted. It was, however, just one study, so it needs to be replicated, but it sent a very strong signal. A 450% increase is the kind of thing that you would only see generally with like a toxic waste spill, something really dramatic. So this captured a lot of attention. And then there was this. This one pretty much broke the internet. This was the finding of microplastics in the human brain. Came out of the Campen lab in 2024 and has been verified, replicated from that lab, seen in other labs also since then. What they found, they looked at human brain tissue. So they took it from cadaver tissues, people who had died between 2016 and 2024, two different tranches of people. So the 2016 decedents and the 2024 decedents. And they looked at that tissue, and yes, they did find plastic. Not only did they find plastic, they found a lot of plastic. They found a lot of plastic, what they put the equivalent to about a plastic spoon worth of plastic, which you've probably heard that statistic. But they especially found, they looked at different organs, they looked at liver and kidney, they found that there was more in the brain than the other organs of the same people. So the concentration, the density of plastic was higher in the brain. It seemed to be moving selectively into the brain. Now, that's interesting. They think that that's probably happening because a lot of the chemicals that are inside of plastic are what's called lipophilic, lipid, fat. They move selectively into fat. And the brain is the fattiest tissue in the body aside from adipose, which is fat itself, right? So your brain is your fattiest organ. That may be why it's moving there selectively. They also found that the brains of people who had a history of Alzheimer's or dementia had 5 to 10 times more plastic than those who didn't. Now, we don't know which side the horse and the cart are on here. We don't know if the plastic is causing in some way dementia or Alzheimer's, or people who do have Alzheimer's have a more porous blood-brain barrier. So maybe it's that the plastic is able to get in. We don't know. This is a preliminary finding, but it was also a fairly striking one. And then there was this one, which this is the one that really caught my attention. They found that over time, between 2016 and 2024, the concentration of plastic in the human brain increased by 50%. So people who died more recently had 50% more plastic in their brains. Now, this was so surprising and interesting that the Campen lab went backward in time and got specimens from other places. So Campen lab is located in New Mexico. They got tissue from Massachusetts, Maryland, and North Carolina over a period of years, and they found that yes, it does look like those concentrations are increasing over time. Why is that happening? The theory here is what we call toxic debt. That plastic that's been lying around since about 1950, fragmenting into micro and nanoplastics, is reaching a point where there are now enough nanoplastics in the environment to be biologically available to enter human tissue. I was just at a conference with Matt Campen's team and a lot of the other microplastics researchers, and a lot of the conference proceedings had to do with how does microplastic fragment into nanoplastic and how long does it take? And in fact, it does look like the timeline for fragmentation matches this timeline here into nanoplastic that's small enough to be bioavailable. So this is really upsetting. So let's all take a breath. These are my daughter's rabbits, Noelle and Lopsy. It's really cold here in New Paltz, New York right now, so they're indoors in a nice cage. We're all having a good time. Breathe in, breathe out. All right, let's keep going. All right, we all wanted to calm down. This is very alarming information. And so the most, I don't know, calming, there was an article that just came out a couple of weeks ago from The Guardian that seems like maybe it calmed down some people. This article purported that a bombshell of doubt has been cast on the discovery of microplastics throughout the human body. And in order to ascertain this, they got a quote from a guy from Dow Chemical who said, you know, so many of these studies are just highly flawed. And they also got a quote from one other researcher, and the reporter here, Damian Carrington, looked over some studies. Now, there are more than 1,000 studies currently published in the microplastics literature a year. He found 7 that he found had been challenged. And based on that information, a quote from Dow, a quote from one other scientist saying that, you know, some of this stuff just seems like it can't be true, and a journalist who found 7 studies, that's the numerator on a denominator of tens of thousands. The Guardian declared, basically, that microplastic science is really shaky and we just don't know enough to be worried. And the next day, Slate picked it up, and you've probably heard about it by now, that, you know, those microplastics researchers, they don't know really as much as they say they do. I will say this article came out while Dana and Ethan and I were at that conference, and one thing it absolutely did was it sucked all the oxygen out of the news cycle that had to do with microplastics so that there was 0 reporting from the conference itself. Nobody heard about any of the new findings on microplastics research. They just heard that maybe microplastic science is no good after all. Well, let's put some of that to rest. The doubt that is being thrown mostly on the Campen study comes from the methodology, the detection method that Matthew Campen and his lab team used to evaluate the brain tissue. What they did was they took the specimen, human tissue, and they dissolved it in a solvent. And Matthew likes to joke because he's from New Mexico that, this is like a Breaking Bad trick, right? This is what we do with where we're trying to get rid of human tissue. You can just, dissolve it. And those of you who've seen the series remember that this was from the first episode where they had a little mishap because the lab assistant didn't use plastic underneath the solvent. So it wound up everywhere. Anyway, what they do once they have dissolved the tissue is they look at what's left. And for that, they use a thing called pyrolysis GCMS. It's a method where they burn the tissue, they examine the vapors. So they burn it here, PY for pyrolysis, then it goes through these coils, and they examine the smoke. And they look at the signature, the chemical signature that they can match for plastics to see, is this plastic? Is this something else? What is this? And what they found when they did that was a lot of plastic. Now, the critique is that, oh, actually, some lipids, fats, are known to look like polyethylene during this process. So that's the basis of the critique. Sometimes some lipids can look like polyethylene, which is, of course, a plastic. And that's true. The Campen team controlled for that. They did find an awful lot of polyethylene. This is what they found in the brain samples and also the kidney and the liver samples. So this is polyethylene, but hashtag not all polyethylene, right? There were a lot of other kinds of plastics hanging around in human organs. And also, even with the controls, they still found quite a bit of genuine polyethylene. Also, the change in the quantity of plastic was consistent over time across all specimens. So this wasn't necessarily a confounder that said that the science was flawed. It was a confounder that said, hopefully there's less polyethylene than we detected, but not that there's nothing there. Now, there is still a lot of conversation about this, microplastic science, what's up? And I will say that what we saw in The Guardian was a solid example of what we've seen in what we call the tobacco playbook, where you magnify or manufacture a scientific uncertainty by emphasizing limitations or variability in order to make make it look like there's a huge debate or a conflict of interest when there's not. Shift the burden of proof, so ask an impossible standard of certainty before action. Say we have to, figure out all of our methodologies before we can even be concerned about all this plastic in the human body. Promote a false balance, make it seem like that fringe dissent is really a huge division. And this is the most important one, delay through research. We cannot take action, says this tactic, because we just need more information. The information we have is not valid. This is very effective. This is what we call the Merchant of Doubt playbook as well. And somebody inside of PSNAP suggested, we should really create a Merchant of Doubt award based on this article. That award would recognize extraordinary commitment to sowing doubt, undermining consensus science, and postponing protections for human and environmental health, often while claiming the mantle of responsible reporting. So for that, I'd like to nominate Roger Coleman, who's the Dow scientist, and Damian Carrington, who was the reporter who put this together, because this is something now that's going to be plaguing the science for quite some time. In the meantime, though, let's get back to the science. The particle effects are those bits that are found, and we're thinking, well, what are they doing? Are they mechanically harming our bodies? Are they creating inflammation? That's part of it. The answer is yes. But on the other side of the ledger are what we call chemical effects, impacts that come from the chemicals that are inside of the plastic as they reach human tissue and leach around. It's kind of the heat and the humidity. One way or another, you get a wet bulb effect. It can be useful to know which is which, but we certainly know there's something going on and that they're interactive. So possible particle effects would include basically mechanical impacts. Oxidative stress, inflammation, damage to cell tissues, toxic trespass. The chemical effects are the ones that we know more about. The chemical effects come from what we already know that we already know, which is that the base materials that go into making plastic are fossil carbons. So oil, fracked gas, and coal are what go into making 99% of plastics that are currently under manufacture. But then in order to get them from oil and coal and fracked gas into, my glasses or My Little Pony, you need to add a lot of additives. There are so many additives in plastics that some plastics can be up to 50% chemical by weight. That's a lot of additives. But then there's a lot of different kinds of additives also. Researchers have identified 16,325 chemicals that can go into plastic manufacture. Of those, 26% are known to be hazardous. That is not under dispute. These are known hazardous chemicals, and by hazardous we mean that they are carcinogens, they're neurotoxicants, or they're hormone disruptors. Less than 1% are considered not hazardous based on incomplete evidence. And then over here, 66% of these are entirely without data at all. They have not been tested for safety in humans or the environment. We don't know what they are or what they do. A lot of them are considered proprietary, but they're out there and they're in here. So how do these harm us? Well, this is the only chemistry slide I'll show you, but it's the basic sense of what plastic is and does. So plastic is composed of this polymer backbone. Those are the carbon-carbon bonds, and they're super strong. They're covalent, so they're the double bonds, really hard to break, and that is why plastic as a synthetic molecule is so enduring. You can't get rid of the stuff very well because you can't break those carbon bonds. Now the chemical additives that give them its properties, and a lot of these are toxic. This is just a handful. These are probably ones that you've heard of, like phthalates, bisphenols, PFAS, brominated flame retardants. They're on the do not eat list, right? They just sit inside the matrix of the chemical. They just inside the molecule rather, which means that they're not bonded or not bonded very strongly if they're bonded at all, and they leach out at every phase of plastic's life cycle, from its earliest conception to its use phase to its discard phase. So they're just constantly coming out of the plastic into whatever is in the surrounding. So if you take one thing from this lecture, it is do not microwave any food in plastic. Don't cook it in plastic. Don't use plastic utensils to handle hot food, because the added heat energy causes those molecules to leach or migrate out of the plastic and directly into your food. If it says microwave safe on it, they're not talking about the food. They're talking about the microwave. This plastic will not physically denature in your microwave. What it does to the food and to you is a totally undisclosed story. And this is the crux of the problem, this migration. Plastic, whether it's as a food handling material or as a micro and nanoplastic inside of your body, has the capacity to get to more points of the environment than any chemical by itself ever could have. Plumes of industrial chemicals move around in the air and the water, but sooner or later there's sort of a diffusion. It's harder for them to get into us. But since we are consistently exposed to plastic directly, and that plastic enters our bodies and stays there, that increases our exposure. So think of a Trojan horse, right? Microplastics and nanoplastics in the human body are basically like Trojan horse particles, spewing out their chemical contents once they get inside our tissue. Now, the most concerning effect of all of this is what I was saying about endocrine disruptors, hormone disruptors, because a lot of the chemicals that are in plastic have the capacity to look to the human body like a hormone, especially estrogen, but quite a lot of others also. In mimicking hormones, they confuse the systems that are used by every organ and every system in your body to signal basic homeostasis. What to grow when to react how, when to fall asleep, how much to eat, how to metabolize that, how much thyroid hormone are you going to have, how much insulin is your body going to make. All of those things are sensitive to your endocrine disruption, your endocrine system, and any kind of disruptor. And those disruptors can have an impact at the tiniest of tiny doses. We're talking 1 part per billion in a number of cases. That means that the periods of greatest vulnerability happen to people who have the most hormonal action at periods that are the most permanent. So for instance, menopause, lots of hormonal action there. Puberty, lots of action there, but the worst of the worst is going to be in utero when bodies are developing. Once you have a grown body and you disrupt the hormones, if you remove the disruptor, things move along okay again. But if you have a body that's building, that's still laying down the pathways that it needs to function in life, and those hormones get disrupted, then the tissues get disrupted. The signals get permanently disrupted. And we see waves of chronic disease that are, well, on the rise. Effectively, what happens in the womb doesn't stay in the womb. Here's some examples. Placenta studies with microplastics in the placenta. Well, we've managed, hello slide, go ahead and advance now. There we go. This is one since that first one that I mentioned, 2022, not much further along, but since finding micro and nanoplastics in the initial placentas, they're now finding them in most placentas that they look at. And in this study, they took 43 pregnant women, they looked for microplastics, and they found that, they found microplastics especially present in the pregnancies that were complicated by fetal growth restriction. Now, what does that mean? It means the fetus didn't grow very well, it didn't grow very fast, the newborns were underweight. They were underweight, they had lower newborn assessment scores. Of the 30 normal pregnancies, they didn't find microplastics in very many of those placentas at all. So the more they look, the more they find, but also when they find them, they're very frequently correlated with harm. That's just at the fetal stage. As you move into neural development, now a child's growing brain is a little bit like train tracks being laid down. They're getting laid down in very specific places. It's happening very fast, and neurons are migrating all over the place and connecting specifically with each other. If they don't connect properly, if you have, say, if you're a New Yorker, you know this map. If you have the A train not intersecting properly with, say, the 1 and the 9 or the N and the R, you wind up with signals, commuters that are stuck, that are unable to get where they're supposed to be as quickly as they're supposed to be, or sometimes at all. What this looks like is neurodevelopmental disorders, which are very much on the uptick. We're seeing much higher rates of ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and the gamut of neurodevelopmental disorders in children that have been born over the last few decades as the burden of plastics has been rising. We also know that endocrine disruptors can be obesogens. Now, this can happen at any phase of life, but what they do is they reprogram the way that we deal with digesting fat, lipids, metabolism. So in an infant or a fetus, this can have a lifelong impact. In a grown-up, it can mean that suddenly you're taking on a lot more weight than you should be, even though you haven't changed your dietary habits much or your exercise habits. Now, why is that? Could be plastics exposure. There's been a fair number of early studies where people are reducing their plastics exposure and having an easier time losing weight. But in any case, obesogenic endocrine disruptors are linked to insulin resistance, increased diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, cardiovascular risk and stroke, and so on. And here's another place we're seeing it. Sperm counts have been declining since at least 1972. They're down by about 50%, and they're going down faster since 2000. Now, the capacity of endocrine disruptors, like the ones that are in plastic, to mimic particularly estrogen, but also other sex hormones, has a lot to do with what we're seeing in reproductive function in humans. And it's pretty serious. All in all, we know that chronic disease is increasing largely along the lines of many of these endocrine systems. We know that this is not genetic because it's happening way too fast. This has to be environmental for a change like this to occur, but it is indeed occurring from places like earlier cancer, colorectal cancer in young people, infertility, problems carrying fetuses to term, problems with maternal diabetes, and so on. So at this point, we're ready to pretty much panic again. And like, no wonder the audience is primed for a nice little article that says, nothing to see here, folks, don't worry about it. I'll just look at the rabbits for a minute and continue to believe the actual science just for now. Okay, take a breath in, take a breath out. Here we go. How do we solve this? Because we can solve this. This is a new problem, and we can see where it came from. So, things we can do immediately. Well, we can start to restrict our own exposure to plastic. Now that's hard because plastic is everywhere, but the first place that you can really see it and you can actually control it is what goes into your mouth, what goes into your body. So start swapping plastics out of your kitchen. Get rid, especially of the black plastic, the plastic utensils, the plastic Tupperware. Get rid of it. Replace it with Pyrex, with metal, with anything you can that's not plastic. Especially get rid of your Teflon. Teflon is made out of PFAS. That's what it is, and it does flake into the food. If you've ever heard of what's called the Teflon flu, that's the impact of the PFAS chemicals moving into your food and sickening you. And the longer something stands in a plastic container, the longer that the chemicals have an opportunity to migrate. So if you buy something in plastic and you have an opportunity, decant it into glass. Or if you're able to, purchase the glass option. Eventually, this can even start to send signals to manufacturers, although the most straightforward signal is to call up the manufacturer and say, hey, I stopped buying your salad dressing because it's only packaged in plastic, and I know that the vinegar in there is acidic and it's bleaching the plastic chemicals. Other things to think about include infant care. Now, this one is harder because practically all baby toys seem to have plastic in them or just be plastic. I will say in Europe right now, there's a push to ban the distribution of plastic baby bottles in hospitals, sending a message to women that that baby bottle should be glass. And in fact, that's what they're substituting now, because it's food handling, it's an infant, it's expensive, and it's more fragile, but it's also less fragile than this little person here. So any place you can find to swap out, do it. And there are some places that it's easier. For instance, textiles. 70% of textiles under manufacture right now are synthetic. They contain some kind of polymer. So it is hard to get away from synthetic textiles. But think about the things that you spend the most time in proximity to, like your sheets. It is still possible to get cotton sheets, to get flannel sheets, even linen sheets. So that's a good place to swap out. Wall-to-wall carpeting is very frequently nylon, polyester. If you can swap that out, you're doing yourself a favor too. And workout clothing, of course, it's mostly lycra, it's mostly synthetic. But when you're heated up, you're sweating into it, it's sweating right back into you. So be cognizant of that as you're choosing your workout gear. Other recommendations have to do with water because a lot of these chemicals move into the water. So a reverse osmosis filter is really the gold standard, but of course it costs gold too. A countertop one by itself is about $510 at the top end. Under the sink is a better option, but more expensive. And frankly, when you're heating up water in the shower, it's able to pass through your skin. If it's carrying PFAS and other toxicants, you don't want that passing through your skin. Now you're looking at a whole house water filter, which is frankly completely out of range of almost everybody, including me. So what do we do here? Well, regulatory systems are frankly the most efficient and the most just way to deal with this problem. And that's what we need to push for. But here's the good news, because there is good news. We have control over this. We still live in a democracy on a state by state level, and we'll see what happens next. But we know from polling that people hate microplastic exposure. 81% of US voters supported in 2025 reducing the production of production of plastic. 78% of US voters support national policies to do so. We support the use of reusable packaging and foodware. This is unambiguous. Things are not changing because the political system has been very constipated, but they can change the more that we communicate, not just with legislators, but also with brands, and we use our dollars also to avoid buying things that don't need to be in plastic. The level of concern is interesting here because it's hinging more and more on the medical ramifications of all of this. 65 to 90% of people think that plastic or microplastic pollution is a concerning problem to human health. People get more interested when they think about health of themselves, their children, and their children's children. And this tells the story too. The most popular, the most well-aired studies about plastics exposure in human organs are the ones that are causing the most concern. People hear about it, they worry about it. The brain, the cardiovascular system, endocrine disruption, fertility and reproduction. I can say from my perusing the literature, look for some very interesting documentaries and coverage coming out very soon on fertility and reproduction. We also know that people are more favorable of politicians who actually take a stand on this. Lawmakers who support measures to reduce the production of plastics have more support from voters. So lawmakers often they'll back off and say, hey, I'm afraid of alienating my base. Well, unless your base is a chemical and plastics manufacturer, you're probably not going to alienate them. So thank you for for listening to this. This is the size of the PSNAP network now. Our purpose is to get out talking in front of crowds like you, in front of medical audiences, in front of lawmakers, anywhere that our voices can have an impact, basically by letting you know the truth about how hazardous plastic can be to human health and the body. That's where we want to be. So I think we've got some time. We'll do some Q&A. Okay, let's see. Dana, you've got you've got a head start on me in reading the questions. Do you have any that you think I should answer right away?
So we've got people have been really awesome about putting questions in the Q&A, not the chat. Thanks everybody. Appreciate that. There's some good comments in the chat, but yeah, if you check out the Q&A that you can see there, Megan.
Yep. All right. Real substitutes in the medical field. The medical field is largely subject to overuse of single-use plastics. I've got a whole stack of them over there, like a disposable blood pressure cuff, not really helping anybody. That kind of thing is marketed to hospitals as reducing infection. But most people aren't spewing, all kinds of fluids when they're having their blood pressure taken. I looked at the marketing claims of the manufacturer on that one, and the citations that they used to justify their safety were from the 1980s, which means that they were thinking about the AIDS pandemic. Uh, AIDS is still an issue, but if you have to go back to 1980s citations to boost a 2025 argument for safety protocols, that means you don't really have the data on your side. So there are things like that. IV bags is a really interesting one. IV bags, because they're made out of polyvinyl chloride, which PS is the most toxic of the plastics. The hierarchy is going to be like polystyrene. Styrene is a carcinogen, and polyvinyl chloride, also a carcinogen. Those are the worst of them, and PVC plastics need a lot of plasticizers in order to get soft. So you've got a carcinogenic product full of plasticizers, and it's going directly into your body on your IV. There are efforts to create other materials. Bebron has a bag that's polyurethane and polypropylene, and that's being pushed, especially in Europe, but it's available here. It's kind of fight by fight. Most of the medical stuff, we're mostly looking at like just the unnecessary things, like going back to cotton gowns, reusable stethoscopes, items that never needed to be disposable plastic in the first place. Well, we take a hard look at the manufacture of some of the plastic materials that go into the body. So first do no harm, right? All right. Let's see. Are the linings of cans made of plastics? Yes, they are. Bisphenol. If you were to dissolve a soda can in a solvent, you would have a plastic bag inside it. So bisphenols are the linings of a lot of like soup cans and food cans, and then soda cans have a plastic liner all unto themselves. Sauna is a place where microplastics can be expelled through sweating. No. There is no known way to expel microplastics from the human body except through your filtration organs themselves. And our bodies are pretty good at getting rid of stuff that's not supposed to be there. A lot of the microplastics and nanoplastics research, actually, including the Campen research, is looking at filtration organs. The liver, the kidneys, those are filtration organs. That's where we expect to see the plastic because the body is pushing it out. So we do a reasonable job over time at expelling them. The problem is that we're constantly re-exposed. And we really don't know the fate of some of these deeper tissue microplastics. You will see advertisements for a kind of therapy where they say that they'll drain the blood from your body and filter all the microplastics out. Do not be fooled. First of all, what are they doing that with? IV tubing. Secondly, not possible because a lot of the microplastics in your body aren't in your blood anyway. So someone's making a buck off of your concern. Okay. The platter shield in the microwave, don't worry about it. That's just spatter. Like that's not really going to be dropping microplastics. It's things that are in contact with food, especially if the food is acidic and if the food is fatty. too. So the acid will help the plastic chemicals to leach, and the fat will absorb them. So, for instance, something you would really want to avoid would be like a cup of tea or coffee in a styrofoam cup. It's going to be leaching those lovely styrene molecules into an acidic product, and then if you add some milk, that milk is going to be binding with a lot of those chemicals and going directly into you. So that's a little bit worrying. Okay, let's see. Um, Lots of rabbit holes, of course.
Megan, there
Yep.
is like a two-part question towards the top. Um,
Okay.
Commonalities in lifestyle.
Right.
I think particularly in the Campen study.
Yeah. So the decedents from whom the tissue was taken were cadavers that I think were unclaimed. Or had been donated, not really sure. They were different ages. We don't know a lot about them as lifestyle goes. We do know that when you replicate these findings across other states and other, I don't know, cadaver demographic like tranches, you see similar stuff. So I can't really answer like what their specific exposures were. That is yet to be told, I think. We do know that though that we are all universally exposed to fairly similar levels. I saw that part of that question was about urban versus rural, and that's an interesting question when you get to things like um, tire wear, for instance. So a lot of plastic, microplastic and nanoplastic comes from tires. And that gets kicked up, especially in cities if you're near to roads and so on. There's going to be a lot more of that in the environment. And so that will show up more versus if you're, in the rural area. But either way, most American adults spend 90% of their time indoors. And, I can just like look around my own study. I'm a person who's cognizant of this all the time. My chair is plastic, that carpet is plastic, the coating on my desk, my computer, which is hot, is also like letting go of plastic. So the microplastic load in my own office is probably really high. Um, and this is a rural setting that I'm in. I do not have a handout. I tend to go with just sort of a rule of thumb at this point, which is let the ick factor move you. If it's being served in plastic, if it's being stored in plastic, if there's a way to reach for it that's not plastic, take the not plastic option. It's not rocket science. And it's not always also, I mean, there's a bias toward people who have more money, have more capacity to change their environment. Absolutely. Um, but the glass jars that I'm decanting my food into in my refrigerator were glass jars from other food. Like, there are options once you realize like how important it is. It's not necessary to wait for the perfect product or the perfect innovation. A new alternative material made out of seaweed is still going to have the same plasticizers in it. It's just seaweed carbon rather than fossil carbon. So find a way to use the more traditional materials, tinfoil, glass, ceramic, Pyrex. Those are far more inert. And I'm sure someone will ask about stasher bags. What do you call it? Oh, shoot. Silicone. Silicone is still plastic. It's from sand. It is more inert than most plastics. So there's still chemical migration, but it's much slower. Do not microwave your food in stasher bags, but you probably are a little safer with them than you are with a conventional plastic bag. So that's stasher. Uh,
Megan, in answer to that
mhm.
question, I'm also going to throw Plastic Pollution Coalition's solutions page into
Yeah,
that Q&A where it has like everything from individual behaviors to societal shift to businesses to all lots of things.
yeah. Glass food containers with plastic lids are basically okay. Again, unless the plastic is touching the food, you're mostly out of the water. By the way, I make it kind of a habit or a practice. I try not to endorse specific brands because they change formulations really quickly. I can't keep up with what they're doing. But the places to go for good information about alternative products, Environmental Working Group, EWG.org, Mammavation, Mammavation. They test products constantly. Consumer Reports also constantly testing products, and Million Marker Institute. They offer a bioassay where basically you send them pee and they tell you what your levels are of phthalates, parabens, bisphenols, and another one that I can't remember. Then they can give you advice about like types of products to move away from. So like scented candles have a lot of phthalates, scented creams and stuff, creams and lotions, lots of phthalates there. And they do have a lot of product information on their own site because they also test. I bother to recommend them even though they are themselves their own brand because the researcher who first really set up the Sentinel on endocrine disruption theory is a woman named Theo Colborn. And later in her life, she created a group called the TEDx Exchange for the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. It was before TED Talks, right? TEDx was doing the endocrine science research for years. Eventually, they puttered out. Theo died. The funding didn't come through anymore. But the scientists who worked there are now over at Million Marker. So I trust the science that's happening at Million Marker because I know those people are endocrine trained literally under like the sensei of the field. So I trust their results also. Um, okay, let's see. Well, we're right at 7. Tinfoil and aluminum foil are the same thing. Is it better to trash plastic or recycle for the environmental impacts? That's a really good question. Um, so when you recycle plastic, you recycle all of the additives that were in the original plastic. You effectively take a toxic product and you recycle it into a toxic product that now has more additives than the original toxic product. So it's not better from an environmental chemical point of view, and it's not better from a human health point of view. Plastics tend to be the most inert, like most things in a landfill, provided that there's not too much leachate moving through it, then they're just sort of entombed there. Burning plastic releases dioxin and other carcinogens, so that's not a good solution. But recycling plastic was never a good solution and was something that was created in 1988 by the plastics industry in order to quell consumer fears that there was too much plastic garbage. So industry said, hey, look, we can recycle this. They invented the recycling logo as you see it now. They took it from real recycling, which is things like glass, cardboard, paper, like those things are thoroughly recyclable. Recycle them. Plastics industry borrowed that chasing arrows and stuck the resin codes for all of plastics 1 through 7 inside it in order to create the idea that what you were handling is recyclable. Only 1s and 2s and very occasionally 5s are recyclable at all. The rest of them, they get collected. Your waste hauler is probably selling them to an incinerator or trashing them or sending them overseas to be sorted elsewhere in case there's still something valuable in them. So the plastics recycling system, it's not that it's broken, it's that it was a scam. Um, it feels good to recycle plastic, but I don't know that we're really recycling plastic. And there's a repeated request to talk about synthetic turf. Synthetic turf initially was created, still a lot of it is tire waste. Can't do anything with a tire. It's too hazardous. You can't burn it. It's not going anywhere. So we had all those like piles and piles of tires. They would catch on fire. It was in The Simpsons, the Springfield tire fire burning since 1982. Industry figured out in the 90s that if you could grind up those tires into little crumbs, then you could label them a recycled material, and suddenly they were not considered toxic, even though they were just the ground up version of toxic tires. Those are what's used in the infill of traditional synthetic turf. So most of the turf that's out there on your kids' playgrounds, that's what it's made out of. And it's constantly leaching all of those crumb rubbers onto your kids' sports equipment, into their hair, and so on. But also the plastic, the blades of grass themselves. Those are made of nylon. they're extruded through machinery that requires a lubricant. To my knowledge, there is no other lubricant in use other than PFAS to get those plastic blades of grass through that machine. So you get a lot of PFAS. I don't know of any plastic grass that's been tested that's come up PFAS free. The way industry is trying to get around it now is saying that they're not intentionally adding PFAS to the product. But you basically have a product that's made out of PFAS, toxic tire crumb, and quite a lot of other noxious plastic chemicals that we're now marketing toward children. So that's the story of synthetic turf. That's the basic science of it. Scientists who try to give webinars in the recent past, last 16 to 18 months, who have volunteered to talk about their research in webinars like this one, have been sued personally by industry before even saying a word about the scientific findings, because industry has decided that the story, the science, the pediatric science of what's happening here is disparaging of their product and likely to cause harm. So they preemptively sue scientists who try to speak to the public about this. Those are called SLAPP suits. SLAPP stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. So if you're not hearing a lot of information about synthetic turf, it's because industry has successfully terrified scientists who would really rather be in the lab or treating children anyway. I'm full of great information today. Sorry, I'm a little angry. I guess the politics of the moment are starting to get to me. Speaking truth to power is becoming more and more important.
Megan, since we have just a little bit, we're a little tiny bit over time, but great question from Serena here. What were some of the findings that got missed by the media from the conference, but that you think are important?
The one that I mentioned about the duration that it takes to move a microplastic particle to a nanoplastic particle, that was the one that really knocked my socks off. Um, it's interesting because the Guardian article came out when it came out. It came out on Tuesday. The conference was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So from Tuesday morning forward, those of us who do a lot of public speaking and a lot of communication became preoccupied. Talking to the press, talking to each other, getting messaging going, flagging the ways in which this is the tobacco playbook, and mostly trying to understand why The Guardian, which is such a reputable paper, which is, usually so independent and free of industry influence, why did The Guardian run such a threadbare article? Like, what was going on there? So we got distracted. I got distracted and I had a lot of trouble following the intricacies of the science because it's very intricate. But because it was mostly a particle science conference about, well, what are the particles? How fast are they made? How are they made? And where do they pop up? I thought that finding about nanoplastics generation, in combination with the fact that we're finding those nanoplastics in human tissues in increasing rates right now, that was the thing that got my attention the most. Has there been pushback directed at The Guardian? Yes, a lot of it. WAPO ran an article that pushed back. There have been a number of, little groups that are like, yay, no more microplastics, isn't this awesome? And there's a lot of talking points now from industry that's, very excited about itself. But a lot of the smaller bloggers, a lot of the smaller rags, there was just one that I noticed that came out from, let's see if I can find my browser because it's open. Uh, Gosh. Uh, Sorry. Ask and I shall try to answer, right? Um, Shoot. It's not popping up. That's annoying that it's not popping up. Um, Well, the short answer was definitely yes. There is pushback, and it's certainly, especially among scientists and researchers, the conversation is going strong. Um, yeah, I'm still looking. I'm not going to find it. Sorry about that. Uh, can't find everything. But yeah, it's out there. You'll see it on LinkedIn too. If you start following people like Leo Trisand, who writes a lot about this. I don't know if Phil Landrigan wrote to The Guardian and got published. Certainly, PSNAP's website has been full of pushback, as our own authors are pushing back. So, and this last one, can I comment on foods that contain C3G and how they may decrease the effects of plastic and their related chemicals? I don't know what C3G is. To my understanding, there's no like supplement or thing that you can take or therapy that you can do to get rid of or mitigate the impacts of plastic once they're in your body, aside from your body doing its own thing to do it. So as a grown up, it does work to decrease your exposure. We've seen that, and the bioassay stuff, like with Million Marker, that works. We've seen it, but I don't know about other methods. So get that plastic stuff out of your kitchen. It's a great reason to eat less processed food, less hyper processed food, because all that hyper processed food, it's gone through a lot of machinery. It's got a lot more plastic and a lot more added chemicals. Okay.
Okay, everybody. Good questions, good comments. Megan, I'll send you a copy of the chat too so you can see all the comments.
Okay, I'll see everybody going, All right, well, we'll be in touch, and you know
All
where to find
right.
us,
Thank
psnap.org.
you. And
Okay,
everyone, this was recorded. It will be on our YouTube in just a few days.
all right.
Thanks.